English translation. 651st Contact Tuesday, the 3rd of May 2016, 21:15 hours.
You are on time, Ptaah, dear friend, but be welcome and greetings. The fact that I asked you to come at this time first was the reason, because I wanted to watch a show on RT television about the Hitler book Mein Kampf, which was banned after the last World War. Recently, this book can be released in Germany, printed again and put on sale. In my opinion, the whole program was not very informative and also banal, as is usually the case with such programs.
Greetings to you too, Edward, my friend. I wonder why you were interested in this mission. Because my father got you this book in 1948. Because you were already interested in it as a teenager and then read it in detail and found it to be a catastrophic manure. As my father literally called your assessment in his notes.
Yeah, that's right, since you're saying it, I remember how I called it. And as far as the program was concerned, I was simply interested in what was said about it and all around it, but everything was banal and meaningless. But it is true that your father Svath brought me the 1948 book of the 22nd edition in 1944, both books in one volume. At that time, I effectively considered the content to be catastrophic crap, and therefore also called it catastrophic crap. Moreover, even at a young age I found that such a book should not be distributed, because the whole content seemed dictatorial and disruptive to order and security, etc., which is why I distanced myself fundamentally from the whole Mein Kampf book nonsense even then. I had long conversations with your father Svath at the time, which also led to him taking me with his ship during the war years to various places in Germany, as well as in Russia and Europe, where I could observe many war events, including the atrocities of the Nazis. At first, despite your father's safety insurances, I often had concerns that the ship could be fired upon, but fears gradually subsided, and I became certain that we could not be seen due to the privacy screen. And if I now see the whole world situation from the point of view of the criminal, political and terrorist machinations of any kind, then I have to state that this book of imbecilities should continue to be banned. If today's neo-Nazi system and all other racist groups, parties and organizations around the world are considered, then since the last World War, the whole of the resulting terrorism has become much worse than it was during the Nazi era in terms of fanatical xenophobia, racial hatred, and religious hatred. Countless paranoid psychopaths of the world have turned into terrorist groups, parties, and organizations, and are tyrannizing humanity. These include dictatorships which still exist today or which exist again, such as the European Union dictatorship, which is just as full of paranoid psychopaths as the governments of the countries of this union and of the United States. And when I speak of the USA, I mean all those who in reality lead the secret power in America and who are responsible for everything. So I exclude the current President Barack Obama, who has to cower and for the sake of his and his family's safety and life, do what he is forced to do against his will, as you have repeatedly stated since he took office and have said several times. However, the media does not say anything about this, but accuses him of anything to the contrary and holds him liable for everything that the secret government orders and the secret services, etc., carry out in murders, injustice and destruction, as well as torture, atrocities, and acts of war. The USA has always been the most vicious and unpredictable terrorists on Earth, and so it turns out that the USA together with the EU dictatorship are currently the biggest terrorists in the world, who do not leave out any common means to provoke Russia and possibly to intervene by force of arms. So they hope that sooner or later, in their greed for power and annexation, madness and irresponsibility, they will be able to launch a war to defeat Russia and annex it to their US-EU dictatorship criminal alliance. As has just been said, it has been the case with the USA since its inception that the world and humanity on Earth have been forced almost uninterruptedly under the thumb of the US with war, intrigues, death, destruction and genocide, and that without the rest of the world doing anything about it. And, as a rule, any intervention is only absent because all states have to fear that they too will at least be harassed by the USA or, in the worst case, will be brought down with murderous acts of war and turned into USA-dependent and subjugated countries. Unfortunately, Since the last World War, nothing has developed for the better, but much worse, because the unstoppably increasing overpopulation has resulted in more and more degenerate, unscrupulous, power-hungry, and criminal paranoid psychopaths who are unpredictable war-loving creatures who come to power and harass their peoples, as well as the peoples of other countries.
This is known to me from my father's records as well as from your conversations in this regard, which were already recorded word for word at that time. And concerning these conversations between you recorded by my father, I was always amazed at your interest and knowledge at your age while reading them. This was also the case with regard to the fact that my father, as you have just said, let you see wars and atrocities that were difficult or impossible even for adult people to bear.
We should not talk about it, because even if I was able to process it, it still evokes very unpleasant memories and emotions. So let's talk about something else, please.
We can do that, but it is also unpleasant what I have to say, about which I have to explain some things. But I do not want to get involved in the matter myself, but only mention and explain certain necessities, because it is not my job to make a judgment, but only to give facts. So it has to be made clear that what Quetzal already explained to you on the 3rd of January, 1982 regarding our foresight, namely that false and slanderous, accusing and misleading allegations with false justifications for leaving the Figu will be made public, is to be made clear, whereby the truthful reasons for this, however, are based on the impossibility of being able to bring the Dominion into the Figu. The self-esteem, self-assertion, and intransigence, etc. of those who have left play just as important a role as their intolerance. The lies and slander are directed against the Figu leadership style, as well as against the behavior of the Figu members and especially against you, whereby the slanderers want to give the impression with self-raising in the form of unjustified and not themselves, or only in a small part accomplished achievement appropriations, that only they would have made possible the center and mission construction, as well as the production of the book and teaching material, etc. The lie is also spread that the interpersonal relations among the group members are inadequate and precarious, which, however, according to our observations and findings, is truthfully not true, but only true for those who have left the group. These have also become word-breaking against their own statements, because according to our General Assembly records, they have generously stated that they will not take any action against the Figu and its members after their resignation. In this respect, however, with their false, factually distorting attacks and accusations on the internet, they are now doing the opposite and spreading lies and slander against the Figu, all its members, and thus also you, overflowing in self-adulation. However, you are not to react to this publicly, but to hide yourselves in silence, because with what the former members concerned announce of themselves with their lying and slanderous accusations and stupid scribbles, they put themselves with their inability to remain with the truth, because they do not become aware of it, at the pillory of shame themselves. And with regard to the stupid writings, which I judge to be unjustified, childishly stupid accusations, I also include the accusation pamphlets known to me, which were supposed to be letters of dismissal, but which only corresponded to diatribes. These resigned ones inflict great damage worldwide by their untrue, unthinking internet publications because they expose themselves as lying and slanderous, but also as arrogant, dishonest, maliciously condemning, and word-breaking, whereby they also reveal which real, unteachable, bad, and autocratic as well as dishonest and revengeful sense they are. I also recognize in their actions a psychotic behavior of the form that they all struggle for their self-understanding and doubt themselves, whereby one person is threateningly, even desperate in the foreground. All, however, are not able to think beyond themselves, following that they lose themselves in themselves. But as far as everyone's concerned, if they persist for a long time in their wrong thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, they can find neither support nor comfort in their unacknowledged unhappiness and dissatisfaction in life. They are all unable to share their thoughts or feelings with another person, so they cannot stand themselves and become depressed, as has been the case with two people for a long time. But the whole thing also leads to the fact that the flight forward is seized, and that in manic form as well. Consequently, uncontrollable life crises occur, in which man loses his limits and the perceptions become stubborn, wrong, incorrect, and untruthful, which leads, for example, as in the matter mentioned, to false open accusations, but also to lies and slander, because the perception takes place unrealistically, and the given facts cannot be judged realistically either. This condition corresponds to psychosis. The loss of reality can also be understood as a protective mechanism when, for example, contradictions between the inner and outer world can no longer be easily balanced out, making it impossible to endure thoughts and feelings or fulfill expectations. Necessary decisions become impossible, and upcoming developments are completely blocked.
Aha, since you say it, I remember what Quetzal said about this coming. And that it will be done another time is the course of things and predictions, just as Quetzal predicted at that time, and the whole thing is inevitable. But the fact that it is now being done on the internet was not mentioned at the time, so I assumed that it was being done in the same context with hypocritical and slanderous greasy leaflets in journal and newspaper articles. This, like the brothers, and then finally cut their fingers into themselves. While for the Figu this was a great success, because the people in our center were trying to find the effective truth on the spot. Of course, we are also restrained in these new attacks, because we are not aware of any guilt, so we do not need justification. Nevertheless, I would like to say, like you, that the Figu, its members, and with it myself, are repeatedly insulted with lies and slander because vindictive know-it-alls, unhappy, dissatisfied and domineering people, as well as former Figu members, could not realize their low ambitions of wanting to play the boss. Oppression of opinion and intolerance, etc. in the Figu. We have often experienced this, which is why we had to break up 3 groups in the USA and 1 group in Japan. It is simply not acceptable for Figu members to play the role of rulers and be able to decide on their own, because the entire group is responsible for every decision. And opinions must be talked about so that every member can raise his word and say what he has to say. We do not need dictatorial, tolerant, and unindulgent behavior, nor the will to rule and oppress that this entails on the part of the members, in order to satisfy their own ambitions for power. Everyone must also have equal rights and full freedom. But unfortunately, there are also members in the Figu sometimes, even for many years, who attack, deny, and slander everything better, good and positive in order to put themselves in a better and good light, but which they are never able to ignite due to their lack of development of consciousness, short-sightedness, self-exaltation, selfishness, and their stubborn and false criticism and willingness to rise above others. But these are poor and pitiful fellow human beings who vegetate in negative, bad, and even evil, envious attitudes, wanting to know better and driven by a lust for power, and who neglect and do not get their lives in order to achieve a good evolution of consciousness, just as they do not get to grips with a healthy psyche. Such people can be given for years and decades, and not infrequently throughout their lives, the best possibilities of instruction to build themselves up as true human beings and to free themselves from all their ballast. Their inadequacy, their ambitions of wanting to rule and be boss, their wrong behavior, their arrogance and self-righteousness. But they don't make it in their self-righteousness and trample the other on their heads and smash their cylinders. Just as they criticize everything that doesn't fit under their hat, because they are too ignorant to really understand something.
Nothing more needs to be said, for what you and I have set forth calls everything necessary in a neutral way, for which nothing more needs to be said or explained.
Exactly. Then the following regarding the pages from Guido's book, which we correct. These are the nuclear physics pages, about which I asked Florina to ask you whether we should not omit them from the book, because the majority of those people who read the book do not understand or are not interested in the whole thing. And on the other hand, we think this nuclear physics treatise does not belong in this book, which fundamentally deals with and should deal with other things, than just general physics and atom physics and other book topic unsuitable insertions.
Already, when we both were editing the book to a large extent, we talked about it and found that such and certain other insertions were wrong, whereby we decided, however, to remove for the time being only certain other parts, which were obviously schoolmasterly and would also snub school-educated adult humans.
That was so, yeah. However, we set certain other parts aside so that we can decide about them later. And if I remember correctly, it was also these nuclear physics pages that now find the whole correction group unsuitable for the book content. Did you make a decision about that now?
Yes, and I believe that we must refrain from doing so and remove the whole issue of nuclear physics from the book, because, as I have thought through and assessed the matter, a lack of interest and a snub would also appear in the future readership, as would all the schoolmasterly topics and passages that we removed from the book early on. It will therefore be necessary for you to clarify what is necessary in the book and to remove the superfluous material.
Well, and thank you, then that's clear and settled. Then something else. Florina has copied the following bulletin reader's question from Mr. Utzinger and my answer, and sent it to you so that you can study it and form an opinion on it. And because you also asked me some time ago if I could write something about the same topic for your interest, for whatever reason, I tried to answer the reader's question and your wish to go into the matter in more detail and to present the whole thing from my personal point of view as an answer. Of course, I was not able to explain the whole of my statements and remarks in 2 or 3 sentences only, so that everything took little more than 7 pages, for which I now want to know whether my efforts are detailed and clear enough for you, or whether I should elaborate further on the written and thus supplement it with other aspects.
Reader's question. I was made aware of your telephone number by an acquaintance who told me a lot about you in a completely different way than I have read about you in general magazines. There is so much said about you, as there is about Switzerland, especially among my colleagues, when I talk about you in Switzerland. That is why I take the liberty now of calling you and asking your personal opinion on various things. You cannot trust all public media, because they are only out to tell lies and keep what's real from the readers. So I want to hear your opinion on my following questions, as well as how you generally behave about the views, opinions and civic duties, beliefs of the people, religions, and races, as well as generally about the army, authorities, police, and government in Switzerland. I am also interested in your opinion on the so-called direct democracy of Switzerland, which is sometimes heard on television, as well as how you assess the democracy of the other states and their various forms of government, of which there are about 4 or 5 different systems in our world. And how do the people of Switzerland behave with regard to government and legislation, etc.? What do you think of the European Union and of Switzerland's form of government? And I am also interested in whether you can tell me how it works and how Swiss politicians conduct their debates. H. Utzinger, Germany.
Reply firstly, it must be explained that there are more than just 4 or 5 forms of government on Mother Earth or in earthly states, or a considerable number of systems of government, to which I will answer in more detail later, as well as in relation to the democracy of Switzerland and other states. Firstly, I would like to say the following regarding my view, opinion and behavior regarding your questions regarding the views, opinions, beliefs, races of people and religions. Basically, I am tolerant and accept uncritically which opinion a person has, which religious community, religion, sect, ideology, and which people, which skin color, which social status, and which gender a person belongs to. For me, it is only important that man leads a righteous life, and that his actions, deeds, and behavior are in accordance with it. It goes without saying that it is also important for me that man lives according to the creational natural laws and recommendations and treats his fellow human beings, nature and its fauna and flora in righteousness, and also lives in honesty, honor, freedom, peace, harmony, and dignity. So it is also far away from me to condemn people for any reasons. Therefore I judge only their good or bad, that is to say, positive or negative thoughts, actions, ideas, deeds, and behaviors, and either accept or reject them, and openly stand by my opinion without ifs or buts. What citizens' duties and their observance and fulfillment in the good and in the right, as well as in the bad and in the bad are, which the citizens of a country have to classify themselves inevitably, whether they want to or not, that cannot be judged by me, because only the citizens of the country concerned can do this. And this is because in the state structures concerned, people are subject to laws, ordinances, and regulations, etc., whose many differences I do not know, and which I cannot judge either. In addition, the individual states are controlled and governed or misgoverned in different political ways. Even today, autocracies, dictatorships, monarchies and republics and various other state systems prevail, in which not infrequently anti-human laws, ordinances, and regulations, etc. prevail, such as the death penalty and torture. And what exists on Earth today regarding the so-called forms of government is partly directly catastrophic, whereby the ordinary citizen has no idea of what is fundamentally behind these systems of government. Exactly this fact caused me to investigate which forms of government and systems of government predominate in earthly countries and states. Therefore, I found the following interesting list of forms of government and states in the Internet at Wikipedia. List of forms of government and systems of government. This list of forms of state and government lists all the systems of government that exist, sorted according to today's two-part view of forms of state, namely republic and monarchy. However, since some political scientists and constitutional law scholars also sometimes distinguish these two forms of government from dictatorial systems, which is not uncontroversial, especially since dictatorships usually call themselves formal legal monarchies or republics. The systems of government that appear there are also explained in more detail below. Monarchy, monarchies, the great lordship of the one, denote an autocracy, or nowadays more aptly a form of state, in which a monarch is the sovereign. The executive power is basically concentrated in one person at the top. Until the 19th century, the monarch exercised the sole power of the state, cf. Monarchic principle. Today, it is not necessarily centralized, which is determined either by succession or by election for life according to traditional rights. A monarch is in office for life or until he voluntarily resigns, but in some states he can also be legally deprived of his office or forced to resign. Variants of the form of government monarchy. Hereditary monarchy. A hereditary monarchy is a monarchy in which the succession to the throne is taken by the descendants of the monarch. Elective monarchy. The monarch is not determined by succession, but by an election. In the following, the possible government systems occurring in monarchies without the dictatorial autocratic systems are listed. Government systems in monarchies. Absolute monarchy. The monarch has unlimited power. The illegitimate, degenerate special form is the tyranny C section on dictatorship. Constitutional monarchy. The power of the monarch is more or less impaired by a constitution. He cannot rule absolutely. Parliamentary monarchy. Quasi-democratic monarchy, since the monarch has exclusively representative tasks. Estates monarchy. Division of the people into several unequally powerful estates. Feudal rule and strong monarchy cf. Middle Ages feudalism. Republic. The Republic Lat. Public affair stands first and foremost for the common good or for the sovereignty of the people. Since the French Revolution, it has been regarded as a counterpart to the monarchy, as a form of government oriented towards the common good. It often goes hand in hand with democracy, but does not have to. The Roman Republic, for example, was not democratic. Parliamentary monarchies are democratic, but not republics. Variants of the state form republic, not always mutually exclusive. Aristocratic republic, form of corporate state rule with predominance of the nobility noble republic, also within the framework of a Senate as Senate aristocracy or with bourgeois patrician predominance. City aristocracy or clerical priesthood priest aristocracy. To be distinguished from this are the labor aristocracy according to Marx et al. And the money aristocracy. Autonomous constituent republic. Autonomous republic which, however, under international law belongs to another, that is to say, a federal republic. Particularly autonomous special form of the Union Republic. Federal Republic, Federal Republic, federation of several partly sovereign member states. Jamahiriya, Jamahiriya, direct democratic Islamic Republic of the people's masses. It was invented and first implemented by Muammar al-Gaddafi in Libya. Islamic Republic, term for states that are partly governed according to Islamic principles, theocracy, on the basis of the Quran. Constitutional Republic, term for republics whose state coercive power is limited by a constitution, and therefore offers citizens security and protection. This type of republic can be found in almost every democracy today. Rzeczpospolita, Polish Common Cause, Polish-Lithuanian aristocratic republics, was, however, de facto electoral monarchy with pronounced aristocratic participation. Subsidiary republic, informal term for republics which were built according to the model of another, historically mainly according to the model of France or Great Britain. Union Republic, Constituent Republic, term for autonomous constituent, republics in a larger group e.g. Federal State. People's Republic, dictatorial, self-designation, mostly for one-party systems, see there, in which a communist party governs autocratically. One-party system, dictatorial rule by a party, often found in real socialist or fascist countries. Military dictatorship, exercise of government through a military system, see also military government, and corresponding hybrid forms. The following is a list of possible government systems in republics without the dictatorial autocratic systems. Government systems in republics. Parliamentary system of government. The offices of head of state and head of government are separate, and the government is always dependent on the trust of Parliament. Presidential system of government. Presidential republic. A republic in which the president is both head of state and head of government, and is elected by quasi-direct popular vote. Semi-presidential system of government, originally term for the political system of France during the Fifth Republic, today also applied to other systems. Mixed type of parliamentary and presidential system. System of parliamentary executive power, republic in which the president is both head of state and head of government, but is elected by Parliament and depends on its trust. Council republic. Rule is exercised over councils directly elected by the people. Directorial system. Republic in which a directorate holds the power of government. Dictatorship. The dictatorship, Latin prescribe, command, is a political system that is usually counted among the forms of rule, but can also be understood as a form of state. Originally, a Roman dictator was a commanding officer, legitimized with special powers over all temporary areas in times of need. In a dictatorship, a single dictator or a small group rules without free elections. Modern dictators, unlike monarchs, come to power not through inheritance or election, but illegitimately by overthrowing a legitimate form of government. For this reason, formal de jure republics or monarchies can also be run dictatorially. Variants of dictatorship. The exercise of power can be either authoritarian or totalitarian. A special case of dictatorship is the dictatorship of the proletariat, that is to say, the rule of the working class, which stems from communist ideology. Government systems. The following table also gives a concrete summary of the dictatorial systems of government. Dictatorships, one-party system. Dictatorial rule by one party, often to be found in real socialist or fascist countries. Military dictatorship, the exercise of government through a military system. Personnel dictatorship, less ideological dictatorship fixed on a leader, and thus the system of government of a dictatorial charismatic rule. Mixed forms, mixed types from the previous dictatorship variants. Tyrannis/despotism, degenerate form of an absolute Gewalt, reign, corresponds to an autocracy or despotism, and is thus an illegitimate dictatorship and arbitrary rule of the monarch. I would now like to say something about this, namely that most citizens of all countries of the world probably hardly know what is really hidden behind the forms of government of their home countries. And that, as I see it, also refers to the majority of the Swiss people, which you also address in your block of questions. So, first of all, I would like to talk about the direct democracy of Switzerland, and briefly also about the Swiss form of government. On the whole, I am personally satisfied with our Swiss government, and also grateful that I can live and do my work in peace and freedom and in relatively good and great security in this, my beautiful home country, Switzerland. And this is something that I can judge very well, because I have lived for years in many countries and have also worked privately for various authorities as a commissioner in the fight against crime, and have consequently gained insight into government systems, legislation and popular opinions, and their ways of life, etc. I have also been able to work for a number of authorities in the field of the fight against crime. So I was able to acquire some knowledge in this respect, and can also acknowledge that the government, namely the Swiss government as a whole in Bern, as well as the government in the cantons and municipalities, but also the army and the police forces in Switzerland, are doing a very good job in other respects, and are exceptionally in a much better position when compared with other states. Certainly there are certain things in the form of views, opinions and aspirations with regard to the party system, which is from questionable to very questionable, such as the traitorous attempt of certain parties and their homeland apostates, or their members, to sell Switzerland off to the EU dictatorship in an irresponsible manner, in disloyalty to their homeland, and thus endanger the entire freedom, peace, neutrality and security of the country. But there are also facts that contradict a direct democracy, as it is wrongly proclaimed again and again, because Switzerland does not effectively have a direct democracy, but a so-called semi-direct democracy. Now, I would like to say something about your question, which relates to the form in which Swiss politicians conduct their debates. In addition, I see the matter with regard to political and parliamentary debates, etc., with the Swiss government in comparison to other states, in such a way that these are conducted far too laxly. In a semi-direct democracy state, such as Switzerland, there should not and should not be any laxity and no cuckoos in political, parliamentary or government debates. There should be open, honest and direct communication, and therefore an absolutely open word. If, however, this is not given effect, then there is a climate of monotony and of talking about the matter, and of protection from the addressed, but especially from the matter, which has to be treated intellectually and rationally, and must be taken in a correct and valuable decision and resolution. If, in such debates, a need for harmony is sought in order to avoid necessary attacks on others who do and advocate the wrong things in an opinionated, know-it-all, thoughtless and frivolous manner, then that is completely wrong. In principle, hard words of hard truth are also necessary in order to conduct valuable debates, and this applies both in a family and in the government. But if this is not accepted by politicians and parliamentarians, if hard words and hard truth must also be valid in political debates, then such politicians, parliamentarians, and government members do not belong in political parties, in a public office, or even in the government. So, for the clarification of all things, and especially with regard to the truth, a two-sided or multi-sided sharp rhetoric must be in the foreground. But if someone cannot or does not want to accept them, for some self-sacrificing reason, etc., then such a person is neither fit for office, politics, parliament, nor government. But as far as the laxity with regard to communication in political, parliamentary and governmental debates in Switzerland is concerned, these could be conducted in sharp rhetoric despite the need for harmony. This is precisely the case if individual incompetent members of the debate, who have to be rhetorically attacked in their way of opinion, action and behavior, and who cannot accept this because they simply insist on their point of view in an autocratic and self-pitiful manner in order to confirm themselves in an unteachable way, would not participate. If I now look at the whole of all earthly systems of government, I find that democracy is fundamentally lacking everywhere in those countries, although I am right to exclude Switzerland, which is effectively a functioning semi-direct democracy, where it is falsely proclaimed, as is usually the case with a republic or a union, etc. I think that the Swiss are the case. I would like to say in particular what I myself understand by this, and specifically by direct democracy, what should actually also be understood by the state by this. Unfortunately, however, there is practically no state in the world in which this direct democracy exists in its entirety, nor democracy in and of itself, except on a larger scale in Switzerland. So even Switzerland cannot be said to correspond to a pure and thus a direct democracy, as it should be understood in principle, but is not handled in a direct way. Unfortunately, this is also the case in my home country, Switzerland, because here too there is only partial democracy, with a party system that often has a ridiculous effect on certain party members, with their stupid hostility towards other parties and their relatives, especially among those who want to force Switzerland under the yoke of the European Union, which through its creation has developed into an effective union dictatorship, which, without the official knowledge of the EU dictatorship peoples, kills people or people in accordance with the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. Reintroduce the death penalty in riots. This is probably because the EU dictators openly visibly early on reckoned that in their union, dictatorship turmoil would be inevitable over time and can only be prevented or contained by violence and the death penalty. What can now be said about Switzerland? Although the Swiss people and the existence of the country, with its government in Bern and with the cantonal and municipal governments in general, are well provided with the federal constitution as well as with legislation, etc. Unfortunately, one cannot speak of a direct democracy, as is so often erroneously proclaimed. For a direct democracy would have to be such that in any case, and absolutely comprehensively in all political, military, social, group economical, governmental and national or state and people important matters, etc., only the people or the citizens would have to decide. This, however, is not the case in Switzerland either, because one or the other is determined by the pure forces of government, as a rule by federal, national and state voting procedures, as well as by official ordinances, etc., and is negotiated and decided over the head of the people, as is the case in the most blatant case, for example on the line, which take place outside a certain part of the will of the people in Brussels with the despotic EU dictatorship. Although Switzerland's political system is such that officially the people are the supreme political authority of the state, and consequently Switzerland's political system is shaped by this principle, according to which the Swiss can express their opinion at the federal level. In the canton and in the municipality, this is unfortunately not the case with certain things. In cooperation with its various parties, the people can also raise various concerns, motions and questions, etc. for a vote, and also effectively vote on them, as can their representatives in the municipal and cantonal governments, as well as in the National Council and in the Council of States in the federal parliament. The federal councils themselves, however, may not be elected by the people, but only by the United Federal Assembly, which contradicts, among other things, the direct democracy, even if a referendum justifies the election of the Federal Council by the United Federal Assembly. The Federal Council, French Conseil Fédéral, Italian Consiglio Federale, Rhaeto-Romanic Council Federal, or the Federal Council as a whole, is the actual and indisputable federal government of the Swiss Confederation in accordance with Art. 174 of the Federal Constitution, which rules as the supreme executive and executive authority of the Swiss Confederation. The male members are called Bundesrat, the female Bundesratin, and popularly also Landesvater and Landesmutter. If it is necessary for linguistic reasons, the Federal Council is also called the Bundesrat as a whole, as a result of the distinction made by the individual members between the authority itself and the people. This is regarded as a collegial authority according to Art. 177 Para. 1. Federal Constitution, which is a huge difference to all other governments of other so-called democratic states. The Federal Council of Switzerland consists of 7 members who have equal rights in each of their Federal Council activities. The members of the Bundesrat are, as I said, elected by the United Federal Assembly for a fixed term of 4 years. In Switzerland, the members of the Federal Council form the supreme power of the national government. They are regulated by legal provisions in the Federal Constitution and in the Parliamentary Act, as well as by informal agreements on the allocation of seats, such as the so-called magic formula practiced from 1959 to 2003, which must actually be understood as concordance in principle, because concordance democracy prevails in Switzerland. Concordance is understood to mean the will to involve as many different social groups, minorities, and parties as possible in a decision-making process, and to determine them by consensus or agreement. This concordance is taken into account by Parliament in the composition of the Federal Council. It should also be said that this has become a tradition in Switzerland over decades, from which the so-called magic formula was formed in 1959. According to this formula, the 3 parties with the most voters, SP, FDP, and CVP, 2 each and the 4th strongest, SVP, could claim a seat in the Federal Council. This composition remained unchanged until 2003. Then a seat changed from the CVP to the SVP because it had become the party with the most voters. The new composition of the 2-2-2-1 formula was partially declared as a new spell formula or simply as a spell formula, which to my knowledge lasted until 2008. In the overall renewal elections of the Federal Council, A distinction must be made between these and the replacement elections for filling vacancy. In Latin, vacantia, being free, being empty. It refers to the fact that an office or a job is currently vacant. A general election of the Federal Council takes place every 4 years, in the first session after the general elections of the National Council, with all 7 Federal Council seats being allocated. If a vacancy arises because a member of the Federal Council resigns or dies during the term of office, a successor is elected separately. However, this member of the Federal Council only holds office until the next general election of the Federal Council. It should also be noted that each year the United Federal Assembly nominates a member of the Federal Council for the presidency of the Confederation, just as the Vice President of the Confederation is appointed for the coming year. How the whole procedure takes place in Switzerland and how the system works can also be read on the internet at Wikipedia as follows: Billy, corrected, to elect a federal councillor. The United Federal Assembly meets on the day of the election in the National Council Hall, chaired by the President of the National Council or deputized for by the Presidency of the Council of States. The male and female national councillors, large chamber of the Parliament of the Swiss Confederation, with 200 members, sit in their usual seats, while the 46 seats for the councils of states are located at the back of the wall. After the opening of the session, in the event of resignation, a laudation by the President of the National Council and a brief address by the resigning member of the government will follow. After that, the chairman of the parties represented in Parliament usually step up to the lectern and announce the election recommendation of their respective party. Further requests to speak also by the candidates are possible. Then the election begins. According to the Parliamentary Act, the election takes place by secret ballot. For each ballot, different colored slips of paper are distributed to prevent electoral fraud. After each ballot, the result is read out by the chairperson. The new Federal Council must be elected by an absolute majority of the votes cast and valid. From the second ballot onwards, candidates with less than 10 votes shall be eliminated, and from the third ballot onwards, the candidate with the lowest number of votes shall be eliminated. If a candidate is elected, he or she is asked by the chairman whether the election is to be accepted. If the person elected is not himself a member of the Federal Assembly, the Assembly shall normally be suspended until the person concerned is present. In rare cases, it has also happened that an elected member asked for a period of reflection, and the meeting was therefore adjourned. If it finally declares acceptance of the election, the swearing-in follows immediately. The person or persons elected, in the event of re-election, shall appear before the Assembly accompanied by the Federal Bible. This is where they take the oath of office. They are then officially called Herr Bundesrat or Frau Bundesratin. 3 levels. Switzerland's policy takes place at 3 levels. The Confederation, cantons, and municipalities can each decide autonomously on certain tasks. The principle of subsidiarity applies. The upper level should only do what the lower level cannot do itself. Direct democracy in no other country can citizens vote on more issues than in Switzerland. The people are the sovereign of the country, that is to say, the highest political authority. It comprises all responsible women and men with Swiss citizenship, over 5.2 million people. Political parties. Switzerland's party landscape is diverse. Some parties are represented at federal level. Others only exist in the communes or cantons. The parties in Switzerland are mostly associations that finance themselves mainly through membership fees and donations. three powers of state Switzerland is structured according to the principle of the separation of powers. State power is divided into three independent areas: the legislature legislation, the executive execution, and the judiciary jurisdiction. Parliament legislative, government executive, courts judicial, co-determination rights. In addition to voting rights and the right to vote, Swiss citizens have other co-determination rights at all levels and can thus play a decisive role in influencing politics. They can, for example, launch an initiative or referendum or submit a petition. So much for the system of government in Switzerland. So let me now address the question of democracy. Democracy, this term, comes from the ancient Greek and means rule of the people. So the opinion of this term is that unlike all other forms of government, only the people have the power and opportunity to exert significant influence on politics. In this respect, I also understand that the term people refers to both sexes, that is to say, women and men, or all citizens of the country or state. Furthermore, the democracy of my understanding is the only form of state in which rules laid down once by the people apply absolutely to all citizens and thus also to officials, military, police, and government persons, etc., including those persons who are responsible for drawing up, exercising, and choosing the laws, commandments, rules, ordinances, and regulations, etc. This is an important difference to all other forms of government existing worldwide, whereas in dictatorships and absolute monarchies, etc., it is customary that the laws, ordinances, and regulations, etc., drawn up do not apply to the rulers who run the country, nor to some extent to their satellites and henchmen, but only to all normal female and male citizens of the people. There are various states in the world that claim to maintain a democracy, some of which differ greatly. Although they have all three principles in common, namely freedom, control, and equality, these are in reality only partially given and also limited, because if the whole is considered, then it is recognizable that the rights, which should be completely valid for all, are not valid for all, if it concerns, for example, criminal cases. The fact is that in these democracies, injustice often takes precedence over justice when rulers, officials, oligarchs, and other public or deserving persons break laws or regulations and then touch them with kid gloves and are leniently and, so to speak, pardoned, excused from any unjustified extenuating circumstances, and punished ridiculously and gently in contrast to the serious crime. And this also happens with serious criminals and serious criminals of all kinds, because in general the false humanity that has emerged for a long time has completely degenerated. As a result, serious crimes are now being punished far too mildly in a false humanistic manner, which means that every form of serious crime, such as murder of all kinds, etc., as well as serious crime and light crime, are becoming more and more prevalent. And the more overpopulation increases, the more and more the whole of false humanity, criminality, and crime of every kind spreads out in ever worse forms, with unfair governments and innumerable corporations cheerfully interfering in it without being able to prove it to them, and therefore not being called to account. The majority of the public bodies that can be bought, such as TV, radio, newspapers, and journals and their journalists, play a very important role in the deliberate misinformation that cheats, deceives, and misleads the people and the readership, and leads them to wrong views and opinions. But as far as the form of democracy is concerned, it must be said that in such a form there must be three fundamental values, such as freedom. This must correspond to a clear legal order, constitution, and laws, and be observed, as well as an expressly desired diversity of opinion must be guaranteed, including freedom of the press, which, however, has unfortunately been for decades, mostly in practically all states, through testimony and interview distorting, dishonorable, self-opinionated, sensational guile, truth-twisting journalists and media are abused shamefully with lies, sensationalism and slander, often paid for by unfair machinations of certain companies, oligarchs, corporations, politicians, and even governments, from which, of course, all righteous journalists are excluded. Democratic freedom also includes freedom of assembly pursuant to Article 20 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations of the 10th of December, 1948. Freedom of assembly and association. 1. Everyone has the right to freedom of assembly and association for peaceful purposes. 2. No one shall be compelled to belong to an association. As well as freedom of opinion under Article 19, Freedom of Opinion and Information, Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations, the 10th of December 1948. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference, and to seek, receive, and disseminate information and ideas with all means of communication, regardless of frontiers. Control. In a democracy, all three powers, Parliament legislative, government executive, courts judiciary, must be clearly separated, the result of free elections must also be accepted, and the people can exercise control over the government. Equality. In a democracy, all citizens must have the same rights and duties, which applies to all officials of authorities and governments, as well as to academics, directors, presidents and presidents, judges and male and female police officers and military personnel, etc. As is the case in Switzerland, such as members of the Federal Council, the National Council, and the Council of States. This equality is not always guaranteed. However, where there is some form of nepotism or nepotism in relation to being better off, as a result of social status and title sneaking, etc., which unfortunately, like everywhere else in the world, cannot be avoided in the democracy of a country, but is concealed by lazy excuses and reasons and false humanity. Democracies exist in three different forms. To my knowledge, indirect democracy, semi-direct democracy, direct democracy. Within these forms, there are partly big differences, which are probably not important to list. But the following is interesting to know about the three forms. Indirect democracy means that the people elect the deputies' legislature, who then elect the government executive. It is the deputies, however, who decide independently on laws and the Constitution, so that the people can only decide through a detour through the laws. Since the deputies are elected by the people, they then also represent their voters in Parliament in decisions concerning laws and the Constitution, but the deputies determine. Semi-direct democracy means that the people elect the deputies' legislature, who in turn elect the government executive. Both the legislature and the executive have the power to influence laws and the Constitution. The people of Switzerland, for example, elect the legislature, the Parliament, in the form of the National Council and the Council of States. These two councils represent their voters and their concerns in legislation, and elect the Federal Council or the executive for the people. But the people can also directly determine laws as well as vote on constitutional amendments, whereby this is possible through initiatives and referendums. So Switzerland is a semi-direct democracy. Direct democracy means that it does not actually exist in its pure form in any other country, apart from two Swiss cantons, Glarus and Appenzell-Innerrhoden, which largely exercise direct democracy through their form of rural municipality, whereby the people directly elect the deputies and members of the government and decide on laws and the constitution. The cantonal parliaments prepare only the votes and have only an advisory function. Addendum, Wikipedia, Declaration for Nepotism, Latin Nepos, nephew, and ism. In German called Vetternwirtschaft, in Swiss German called Vetterliwirtschaft, refers to an excessive provision of advantages by or for family members or relatives. Examples of this preference are the granting of abnormally favorable contractual conditions to relatives or the failure to carry out necessary checks on relatives at the expense of an institution or company in which a family member holds a managerial position. In Swabian, one speaks of nepotism if it is not family members but other persons who are the beneficiaries of the advantage created. One also speaks of favoritism, see also clientele policy. In the Bavarian-speaking area, regardless of a family association, it is called special economy Spezi or Spezial equal sign Bayer. Friend, in Austria friendship economy. In the Rhineland, one speaks of the clique. Shift can also be a form of nepotism. The term cousin is hardly used anymore today. Used to be called cousins. Nepotism means that someone in an influential position provides relatives, sometimes acquaintances or friends, with good posts. This means that a person is not placed in a certain position because of his or her abilities, but because of the relationship or friendship. Cronyism is also called nepotism. The Latin word nepote means nephew or relative in German. In earlier times, nepotism was widespread. Some rulers appointed relatives to high offices and expected that they would be grateful to them for this and would put their concerns into practice. This, I think, is probably the most necessary and important thing that has been said and explains. With regard to your block of questions, and therefore also your speech and answer, what took some time for all the speeches and should also be enough? Billy.
How you have explained the whole thing is detailed enough. So I think that further explanations are not necessary, but make everything understandable and also clarify the mentioned things from your point of view.
Thank you. It's an honor to be of service to you. But may I ask you what you think of the behavior and actions of the Turkish dictator Erdogan?
Through his predisposition, he has in fact already turned into a dictator some time ago, whereby he is trapped in a delusional form in religious, conservative, or regressive, backward, and power-obsessed sectarianism. As a dictator, he lives under the delusion that he does not have to be bound by any legal norms. Following that, he arbitrarily interprets existing and traditional laws, applies them and has them implemented by his henchmen, and thus terrorizes that part of the people who is against his dictatorial sectarian reign, his megalomania and personality mania, and his self-assertion. For quite some time now, he has imagined himself as the absolute ruler of the state, has already shown the first traits of a tyrant, is despotically inclined, and strives for autocracy, tyranny, and oppression of the people.
Aha, about in this frame I appreciate him too. When I think of Hitler, Stalin, and all the other dictators who ever ruled over the peoples of Earth and murdered millions and millions of people and drove them into misery and need, precisely in their greed for power and paranoid psychopathy, then I am horrified. When I think of what can still develop in Turkey as a government, when the Erdogan madness is not stopped, when Turkey may still be admitted to the EU dictatorship and two dictatorships then do their mischief in Europe, then the European people still have a lot of evil ahead of them.
What Erdogan is doing is, in my view, an evil dictatorial regime from which nothing good can be expected. And as a result, the machinations concerning the refugee arrangements that were made between the dictator and the German chancellor, who was not realistic and naive, as well as the EU dictatorship, are already now giving rise to problems that call everything into question.
That was to be expected. But something else. What do you think about my opinion that in my understanding terrorists and terrorist-like and tortuous military are not soldiers, but murderous, violent, and war criminals, who must also be treated as such and sent into lifelong exile? Normal soldiers are usually fighters recruited by the state, who are under oath and classified in the Geneva Conventions or Conventions of 1949, which until today existing. Rules for the protection of wounded and sick military personnel on land and at sea, as well as prisoners of war and individual agreements were laid down. The protection of civilians in armed conflicts was also newly enshrined in a Fourth Geneva Convention. In particular, the Third and Fourth Agreements contain detailed human rights guarantees in favor of prisoners of war and civilians. A single exception, the common Article 3 of the four Geneva Conventions, contains absolutely fundamental human rights which are only applied during international armed conflicts.
You know my opinion that I can only confirm and endorse yours.
What do you think about it? If I may come back to the matter of resigned FIGU members, that the resigned members did not exercise the necessary indulgence and tolerance towards group members who made mistakes, wrong actions and behavioral errors, or did not observe articles of association and statutes as well as group resolutions correctly. Furthermore, in their bossy, self-righteous arrogance, those who had left the chamber were not accepted in their logical objections, opinions, necessary improvements and innovations, as well as advice or proposals, and were slanderously insulted as preconceived decisions or resolutions, etc., while on the other hand, bossy, illogical, and freedom-impairing measures were demanded of them, which could not possibly be affirmed. The reason for this was that the bossy efforts of those who had resigned could not be permitted, who for a long time had tried to control and dominate the FIGU association and the core group members. But this is exactly what they deny and slanderously state, that we FIGU members. And so, of course, I, as KG member and head of the association in the first place, have malicious efforts of domination. And because they did not succeed in this, the FIGU membership was cancelled, and I was attacked as a leader, because I always intervened against such machinations that were hostile to freedom, figurines, groups, and illegal. In my opinion, such behavior of the will to dominate violates the personal freedom of man as well as his freedom of action and opinion, because he must be allowed to make mistakes and to correct or excuse them by making corrections. Also the human being, thus also every FIGU member, must be given the freedom to free himself from his duties for plausible reasons. For example, if a school course stays abroad as a result of work, or if illness or accident, etc. require this.
I can understand why you should talk about it again, because what you have said now was still necessary in my opinion. During our conversation so far, I thought about various things, which was not the case at the beginning of our conversation when I raised the matter. So I too would like to say a word about this, and that is the following. All FIGU members of the core group and passive group are free people in every respect, who are neither controlled by you, nor by other members, nor by us. But what is maliciously claimed to the contrary by resigned FIGU members is an arrogance and a lie that clearly shows that those concerned are selfish, truthful, diminutive, and in need of recognition, following which they put themselves in the foreground with false accusations against others with lie claims to try to express themselves as victims. They clearly prove this with lies and slander, which are based on the false need to have to justify oneself publicly on the internet. They are not able to consider that they, unwisely denouncing themselves, make their lower attitude public by defaming and discrediting themselves against the FIGU and you, and show that they have not brought about any noteworthy positive change with regard to their development of consciousness all this time in the association FIGU, and therefore have not learned anything in their selfishness, and also have not changed their negative thinking, acting, and behavior into good forms. So they are also not aware that in their striving for self-righteousness, their selfishness and their mastery and self-opinionateness, they do not understand that it is up to free people to make mistakes, to violate rules and regulations in order to correct the mistakes and possibly to be reprimanded for the violations, so that they learn from them. Nor can they understand that, from the point of view of humanity, indulgence and tolerance must be cultivated in relation to making mistakes and contravening rules and regulations, but never pressure, violence, punishment, and coercion, and certainly not in a bossy or arrogant manner, etc., as was striven for by those who had left, in order to shape the line and direction of the Figu Association according to their imperious interests and to lead it in the wrong way, which would drive everything that has been built up and developed into ruin. I want to have said this after my first remarks, because I reconsidered everything and find that according to our notes and my personal observations and findings, the necessary must also be clarified by me.
Thank you very much for that. For my part, I mentioned the whole thing again but let's not do that because I think any more words would be superfluous. So I want to come up with some questions that on the one hand interest me personally, but on the other hand have been asked as bulletin questions, which I have to ask you to answer.
You know that
the questions are not addressed to you, but to me, just as bulletin questions. Because I cannot answer them.
I see, then I am willing to answer when it falls within my means.
Thank you. We have repeatedly spoken about the so-called UFOs and the 4 groupings that just turn around in earthly space with unknown flying objects. And to these 4 groupings belongs also the group of the Earth Future Ones, which are however actually 2 groupings in themselves, as you already told me at the beginning of our contacts with private conversations. Your daughter Simyase, but also Quetzal and yourself talked about it. But it was never published in discussion reports, because it was always private. So it was not until more recent times when you made certain observations and gained unambiguous insights and came to important evidence that there was a halfway open discussion about it. I would now like to ask to what extent it is permitted to talk about this in an even more open way now, as well as with regard to the fact that the grouping of the Earth Future Ones actually corresponds to 2 groupings and why you call them so, and only as 1 grouping. Because they are actually 2 of them?
There is no real secrecy about this, because we have cautiously only vaguely talked about it because we lacked certain evidence, which we now have and which has provided us with good knowledge and caused us not to seek contact with either group in the future. And we call these groupings Earth Future Ones, because the one grouping is effectively Earth Future, or exists in the distant future on Earth, and comes through time bridges into the present time.
Excuse me, by time bridges you mean time travel, as we say? In this case, the future Earth humans are those Earthlings of the distant earthly time who already live on Earth in the distant future, and who, through the possibility of their time travel technique with their various small and large futuristic flying machines, have been coming into earthly presence since time immemorial and also into our present today. However, this is also done by the other group Earth Future Ones, which has its state in a certain underground area of Earth, has a general futuristic technology, and therefore also very highly developed aircraft. These aircrafts, which I call so in your sense, are an earthly technical development for today, which is completely futuristic, that is to say progressive, innovative, progressive, trend-setting, ahead of the present time and therefore trend-setting, etc. With regard to this second grouping, which you also call future Earth humans, it must be said that these are not, however, descendants of extraterrestrials from the distant future of Earth, nor are they direct, but indirect, very distant descendants of extraterrestrials. These people live deep underground under Earth's surface, and with their futuristic flying machines they also turn around in Earth's airspace, as I already knew from Asket, because she had already initiated me in this regard in the 1950s, but she was spoke. Also your daughter Simyase, Quetzal, and you explained a lot to me, but you always said that I shouldn't talk about it officially because it's not the time yet. It is mainly this group of the future that makes a name for itself again and again, especially in the Western world. And this happens very often. and interestingly enough, most often in the Western Hemisphere, which we call the geographically conceived Western Hemisphere with this term, as a counterpart to the Eastern Hemisphere or hemisphere. If I remember correctly, the two imaginary hemispheres are separated by the 0 degrees reference meridian at Greenwich and the so-called anti-meridian at 180 degree. Accordingly, the areas west of London, West Africa, and the entire regions of North and South America, Patagonia, Greenland, and Canada belong to the Western Hemisphere, where most sightings of various small and large and even gigantic UFOs or futuristic flying objects of the inner terrestrials appear. Especially the UFO appearances in Arizona, in Belgium, and in England, which were probably traced back to these Earth future ones, caused a huge sensation in the worldwide media. I would be interested to know why these Earth future ones are so frequent in the Western Hemisphere and still are today, because in the Eastern Hemisphere such futuristic aircraft or UFOs are observed less often. That is to say, in the majority of Europe, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and Oceania, which are counted to the Eastern Hemisphere. It should also be said that, according to the so-called Monroe Doctrine of 1823, the Western Hemisphere is often equated with the New World or with America and the neighboring island states or politically delimited by the member states of NATO.
What you say is correct. And the reason why the interterrestrial and also earthly future Earth future ones operate especially in the Western Hemisphere is to be justified with this, about which, however, silence is required.
But why? This is the question. Do you call these inhabitants of Earth also Earth future ones, of whom we have already spoken before and whom, with a few exceptions, you have always named only in this way without giving an explanation? That is simply not clear to me, nor is it clear to me why you have never said anything more specific about it or defined the term exactly.
The reason for our name Earth Future Ones is based on the fact that the entire technology of the inhabitants of Earth's interior state corresponds to a future earthly technology, which will only find its beginning in the near future and also will only become reality in the distant future. And the fact that we never talked about it in detail and made no statements was because you never asked about it in your restraint and always kept to observe and keep silent about our directives. We greatly appreciated that, and besides, you have never been driven by curiosity in a way that could have embarrassed us about our directives. And what we ever explained to you, including secret things, was always out of necessity, but we could always rely on you keeping the word to keep silent under all circumstances.
All right, we don't have to talk about that, because you answered my question, so you don't need it anymore. Then again, a question. Are the three that I have and I met, as well as the two and so relatives of this what you call her by her real name? If so, then they live in the subterranean state structure in the area of, but they also go under the people on Earth's surface, but despite remain unrecognized or are replaced by the surface Earth objects in because they may know a lot about you.
That is also true, but there is a duty of secrecy about it, because our directives do not allow us to officially divulge our findings, because it would inevitably result in warlike and conquering actions. This would be the case if predictably and inevitably certain power-hungry statesmen of certain countries, with their military forces and secret services, etc., were to break into the underground state structure in order to protect the far-reaching futuristic technology of the to get your hands on it.
You've told me about your directives many times before, and I'm sticking to them. But what we just said about that can remain official, right?
No names, or places may be mentioned. And it must also be clear that we will continue to make no contact whatsoever with these groups.
Which I know your reasons for. Well then, with what I now come to the questions that relate to bulletin reader questions that I cannot answer and therefore have to ask you for answers, if you permit.
So these are questions that you, not me, were asked to answer. You know that questions from other people to us are not answered, but only those that concern your interest.
Yeah, I know. And the questions that have been put to me are of course of particular interest to me, because I have never asked you questions about these things before, and therefore have an interest myself in getting answers to them. And look here, the fax request, it says, "Today I have several questions for Billy."
Ptaah reads,
Good, I will answer the questions then.
Thank you. Then I will begin with the first question. How do the Pleiarians and the members of their federation feel about alliance love or about entering into love relationships? How high is the proportion of Pleiarian women and men in the total population who are classified into a polygamous alliance?
Our federations are in no way subject to the provisions, laws, and regulations of the relevant Pleiaran forms, for all federations have their own, over which we Pleiarans do not exercise control. However, in all federations it is given that their own regulations, laws, and ordinances are largely, but not necessarily, aligned with our Pleiaran values. And with regard to your question, I must call up the necessary information because I am not familiar with it. You have to be patient a little bit. Yes, here, there are the necessary statistically administratively registered records of polygamists, monogamous and free alliances and alliances. The number of women and men out of the total population of registered polygamous alliances is not known to me personally. But only the last statistics, which were evaluated according to earthly time 2 Earth years ago, and resulted in a result of such alliances of 62% according to the total population.
The rule with you is 1 to 3 or a man to 3 women, but more rarely also 1 to 4. But what about monogamous alliances? Lack of alliances or being single or alone and unregistered or free alliances, as you say, which are called wild marriage by us? Can you please also name the dates in this regard?
Of course. Monogamous alliances are listed here according to statistics with 5%. Non-alignment with 7%, and free alliances with 26% of the total population, whereby here also in this respect, no numerical data are given.
That'll do, thank you. The next question is, in spite of the high level of consciousness and self-control of the Pleiaran, are there still problems with jealousy, claims to possessions, and comparable emotions between partners who have united in an alliance love?
Unfortunately, such unworthiness can also appear with our Pleiaran peoples, but in extremely few cases such unworthiness results, which are usually regulated without exception peacefully in the end, and whereby the misconstrued in this way end their alliance for reasons of reason and remain from now on usually unaligned.
Good and patented regulation, I think. Then the following question. How do the Pleiaran keep it with the personal freedom within the alliance love form? Are there any obligations and mutual dependencies that restrict freedom?
Every form of alliance contains obligations for all persons of both sexes who are in alliances, which must be clarified and adhered to jointly in the alliance partnerships between the performers of the alliances. Personal freedom must not be negatively affected in any way, but must be preserved and exercised. So, in the case of alliances of all forms, the necessary obligations must also be discussed and complied with in mutuality, with no dependencies whatsoever being allowed to appear, which could restrict freedom, because, as I explained, personal freedom must never be negatively affected. Personal freedom inevitably excludes degenerations of any kind that could question, damage, or dissolve the alliance, and consequently degenerating incidents in alliances are extremely rare.
This should also be the case here on Earth. But the opposite is the case, because on the one hand, women are still today treated as second goods and as underpaid working animals, but many are also exploited, abused, and raped by dog flots. This also happens to a very high percentage in officially closed marriages, as well as in wild marriages and in friendships, etc. Many women are exploited, humiliated, abused, beaten and psychologically completely destroyed by their husband or boyfriend, etc. out of a false love of thought and feeling. Without their resistance as a result of their dependence, fear, and false love or out of bondage, and without being humbly vegged like beaten dogs and letting all evil pass over them. But I have other questions, like these. How do the Pleiarani women and men practice everyday life in a polygamous alliance? Does the man live alternately with a woman with whom he may have children, or do all of them live together in a polygamous alliance of united partners in a house or in a common dwelling?
In this respect, there are various forms depending on the agreements between the husband and his wives. Thus, both polygamous alliance communities in a single dwelling may be possible, as well as polygamous alliances in separate dwellings in one place or in different places for each woman and her children can be maintained. This depends on the agreements of the allies.
Then that's clear too. Then the following question. Who takes care of the upbringing of the children in a polygamous alliance?
Of course, the education of children is without exception the task of the biological mother and father.
Sure, can't and shouldn't be any different, I guess. Then this question. Do Pleiadian women practice same-sex love or sexuality among themselves?
This is not the rule, but it can be absolutely possible, which is also the case for rights, if certain women have corresponding bisexual predispositions.
You regard male homosexuality and female lesbianism as natural normal, as you once said, and consequently there are also homosexual and lesbian alliances, which can also result in monogamous and polygamous alliances of female-male form.
That's right, too.
Then there was this question. It was once said that a couple should get to know each other better over a certain period of time in the Pleiadian, before an alliance is formed, and then it is examined whether the two people really should fit together and form an alliance. How exactly do the Pleiadian and their spiritual leaders determine whether two people fit together so well that they can enter into an alliance love?
Such exams are absolutely voluntary, but are nevertheless conditional on registration and are recommended and offered by the spirit leadership and used and conducted by the allies of all kinds. For more than 3,000 years, no case has been known that an alliance would have been formed without these prior checks, which also applies to the free alliances. In this way, false alliances are so extremely rare that they are not recorded statistically. The tests themselves are carried out after very precise and varied clarifications, factor analyses and tests, primarily with regard to the type and condition of the partnership relationship, the character value, as well as with regard to partnership freedom, partnership behavior, partnership relationship ability, descendant parenting skills, partnership crisis management skills, partnership compromise skills, partnership handling skills, partnership willingness, partnership ability, partnership trust, partnership openness, partnership attitude, partnership communication and partnership commonalities, etc. The entire list of clarifications. Factor analysis and tests include 70 important moments, which also include non-partnership and social, but also psychological and interpersonal relationships, as well as educational and lifestyle values, etc. All of which, however, would have to be enumerated.
Note in Jhana. Exam takes 3 to 6 days depending on the time.
The above should suffice. Thank you very much for that, and it's also very interesting. It also answers the last question I was asked about how Earthlings should proceed if they want to form an alliance. All I can say about this is that the people of Earth should test themselves in about the same or similar way in all the things you have mentioned and act accordingly. And with regard to jealousy and all other evils, etc., which appear among Earthlings in a marriage, in dealing with fellow human beings and in general in life, I can only recommend to study the spiritual doctrine, to implement it effectively in every respect and to live it. But here, Ptaah, are these questions you should please read.
In this respect, I do not yet know the dates. However, as far as the question here is concerned that a wrongly elected ruler should be removed from office, brought to justice and replaced by rational and responsible action. First and foremost, the irresponsible and unrealistically naive German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who is fundamentally responsible for creating the refugee masses through her criminal welcoming culture, hits the nail on the head. But this also includes all their equally wrongly decisive, madly acting, power-obsessed, and irresponsible supporters and followers. Secondly, only effective, humane, but strict, thoroughgoing. Unyielding and possibly even rigid measures could be necessary to curb the flow of refugees, which would, however, have to be implemented in accordance with the possibilities of each individual state. However, all the measures to be taken must not only be aimed at real and false refugees, but also at individual traffickers and gangs of traffickers who must be approached in a particularly radical and intransigent manner. They would have to be held to account in a hard way, and their criminal work would have to be stopped and made impossible for them. Not by inadequate border guards, but only by well-trained special military, police, and security forces.
Well meant, but hard done. In my opinion, the world community should finally become reality, stand together and act. But so far it consists only of big and empty words of power-hungry power holders. And instead of finally bringing about such a community in a peaceful way, the state leaders dictatorially hate and rush against other countries or their own country, with the USA and EU dictatorship at the forefront of this. And they are doing this especially against Russia, in order to sooner or later, in their greed for war and power, to start a war, possibly the Fourth World War, and to be able to bring Russia and its friendly states under their thumb. So the EU dictatorship in particular and the USA, which has been a terrorist state for centuries, have fanned the fire of war and terror all over the world, which has led to the emergence of new world terrorist organizations, many of which are sectarian, such as the Islamist sectarian Al-Qaeda, the Islamist State, Boko Haram, and so on. And because no action is taken against these terrorist organizations in a decisively useful, intransigent and correct way, and these terrorist organizations are not dissolved and not destroyed, they can continue to bring much misery and suffering about the world and mankind. But that is also only a bare calculation of those criminal statesmen, smeared with millions, who thereby contribute to the preservation and constant stimulation of the arms industry, whereby arms corporations earn billions and the arms industry states and their governments can make billions of taxes. These are also reasons for the fact that no effective world community can be established. Consequently, no world community multinational peacekeeping force can be created, which could intervene immediately and relentlessly in every country in which warlike and terrorist actions take place, in order to end all burgeoning or existing acts of war and terror and to pacify the country, as well as to ensure that a healthy economy and sufficient work, as well as peace, freedom, and prosperity for the populations could come about. All in all, however, as a result of false humanism, everything is wrong, crooked and wrong in this respect, as well as in relation to the fight against all the terrorist organizations worldwide, as well as against the actual criminal organizations and racist organizations. And this happens simply because it is not radically, but only unseriously, laxly, and half-heartedly, that people take action against it and consequently do not take the right action, but only act leniently, falsely humanistically, and softly. But the majority of earthly mankind is worrying more and more in every respect, consequently exploitation, wars, terrorism, criminality, racism, sectarianism, and crime. Digitalism also contributes to this, through which people atrophy because they are digitally ill or digital manic and addicted to digitalitis, and are therefore no longer capable of genuine and true interpersonal relationships and effective face-to-face communication. Today, the digital world determines the life of the majority of earthly mankind, because for it the acute current reality and its truth can no longer be grasped. The fact is that for countless people, reality is already something strange and incomprehensible that they can no longer even perceive, let alone understand. In this state, people are already functionally limited with regard to the thought-feel-psych-consciousness world, and in my opinion, with regard to ratio, they are somehow already limited or stricken and no longer fully addressable. Countless children, adolescents, and adults are addicts to digitization who completely isolate themselves from their fellow human beings, nature, society, and the environment as a whole. This consequence of digitization, which has taken the majority of society by storm, is the consequence of the so-called digital revolution, which began at the end of the 20th century. From then on, a rapid technological change in favor of computers and the internet occurred, which became so socially relevant that this digital revolution led to a radical upheaval in terms of a kind of digitalism communication between people. And this has happened to the detriment of the personal relationships of man to man, following which hardly any more personal conversations from face to face and thus from eye to eye take place. Consequently, people become more and more alienated from each other. The digital revolution has definitely overrun humanity, and that is not a good thing because of the unreasonableness of human beings. They cannot use digital technology sensibly, and therefore cannot control it, so they are controlled by it in their pathological digitalitis. So there are signs of a mania where there is usually a decrease in digitalitis urge and increased digitalitis activity, as well as an elevated digitalitis mood. And this positive mood is contagious and distributed among all those involved in such digitalitis activities. Typical for these digitalitis people is also a reduced self-confidence, their self-esteem, their isolation from the world, lack of interest in life and initiative, etc., etc. Digitalization has penetrated virtually all areas of everyday life and is so deeply rooted everywhere that humanity is morbidly dependent on it. Nobody can and wants to imagine his life and existence or everyday life without computer, iPad, app, etc., because the digitalism addiction has degenerated into an affective mania. That is to say, into a pathological high spirits, which has serious and fatal personality changing, interpersonal, psychosocial, financial, and cultural consequences. The reason for this is that digitization is fundamentally changing all areas of people and all industries of all kinds. There are examples of this in the cultural field en masse. Areas of work such as agriculture, construction, technology, medicine, politics, sound storage media, games, films, videos and photography, etc., etc., but nothing is done against it. On the contrary, the whole thing is promoted by companies, corporations, and even by offices, organizations, and governments, without considering that the whole delusion of digitization will sooner or later lead to a human, social, and technical catastrophe. This is already pre-programmed by the irresponsible misuse of digitization. Humanity, and especially all those responsible in the world, do not think about this, but only when, at the end of the manic digitalitis high spirits, a heap of shards or an irredeemable chaos and misery of stunted family, social, human, partnership, personal, economic, and worldwide rottenness, depravity, devastation, and destruction has been brought about.
There's no arguing about that, because I can only confirm every word you say. Besides, there would be a lot more to say. In my opinion, however, all statements, explanations, admonitions, and good and important advice are just as meaningless and fall on infertile ground as in many other relationships. But now, Edouard, dear friend, I must go my way again, for my duties call me. I will not return until the next month, because I have some obligations that will take a long time. If there is a need, please call Florina or Njana. Goodbye, dear friend, and pleasant time.
Thank you, Ptaah. Goodbye too, my friend.